Around the turn of the century, our grandparents were just as keen on gadgets as we are today, and many of them had money for hobbies like this. Among them were the country's first filmmakers, and it's to these hand-cranking amateurs that we're indebted for the early footage for this series, the years back. The death of Queen Victoria ended an era of strict Puritanism, so that when her playboy son, Edward VII, ascended the throne in 1902, everybody was more than ready for the freedom and gaiety that his reign brought in. Here in New Zealand, the depression of the 80s was over, and there was time for enjoyment. Shows and carnivals attracted people from all over, from the mud tracks of the inland bush clearings a day's ride away, and from the coastal settlements along the railway tracks. And there too came our movie makers, busily recording on film, luckily for us, the day-to-day happenings of the 20th century. For the people who lived in Taranaki during those early times, the weekend excursion to Eltham's Axeman's Carnival was quite irresistible.
The show was, well, more than a Wild West show. The bulk of the people who arrived was in the horse and gig days. The whole of the main street had gigs down each side. The side streets had them. Everybody that had a paddock had horses in. And they came from everywhere around, even as far as Opanaki, 25 mile away. Because you've got to remember that although it only started here, within about 4 years, they jumped from nothing to world status. They were the world championships in that time. The saw people and axe people, they must have sponsored men, because they couldn't come from Australia and Canada and spend a week here doing nothing. Well, it was a world championship chop, and you had to come to Eltham to win it.
Local people didn't travel much in those days. Their world was close to their town. But if the need arose, there were the Cobb and Company coaches. Each driver and his coach built their own reputation and acted as the fetch and carry between town and country.
Often we'd get together and we'd have little picnics with the young people, and we'd all go to the bush. We'd boil the billy and have quite a nice time. And my husband and I used to, well, before he was my husband, we used to go for rides on Sunday afternoon on horseback. I used to have a very nice hack, and so did he. And we used to go for rides all around the country, and back home in time for tea.
The conditions of the roads and hard springs made travelling by coach a test of endurance.
Well, they called it reasonable comfort. It had standards up the side and a few curtains you let down with gaps of about an inch between to let all the draft through. It certainly kept the rain off. We had 3 or 4 fords to come through, and one was fairly deep and going fast, so we got a big boulder and we heaved it in onto the floor because the water was coming up the floorboards. Today you'd have to get a permit, I suppose, from the Minister of Marine to make a trip like that.
But they were hardy in those days, I think. There was no sealed roads, just shingle roads and wheel marks. There was only smooth parts on the road where the wheels went. I remember my brother used to ride on the penny farthing. And my eldest brother, when I was 21, he bought me what they called a safety bicycle with 2 wheelers. Oh, I thought I was made. I was about the only one in the district that had a 2-wheeler.
My wife's mother and father, they regarded as extravagant. They went and spent £60, if you please, on a gig. Flash. And, you know, people spoke about it. It was a waste of money, extravagance. Rubber-tired ones, too, instead of iron. The latest thing, you see. But that was, of course, the value of money those days.
For some, all of them Europeans, there was money aplenty, and what they wanted to buy with it was more and more land. To check land grabbing and to encourage the Maoris to farm what remained of their holdings, the government made it legal for only the Crown to acquire Maori land. This acquisition was called purchase by some. Others had a different name for it.
There was massive confiscation of land. The effect of it was the withdrawal of the Maori people, psychological and physical in some cases. It also meant a decline in numbers. Population dropped dramatically at that stage, and it was a long time before there was any feeling of coming out at all to meet up with Pākehā world again.
They waited for leadership.
Young students like Apira Nangata, Terangihiro Buck, Wirape from the Bay of Plenty, James Carroll, of course. They were about the 4 young leaders who emerged about the turn of the century and showed how education would improve the lot of the Maori people. James Carroll was the first Maori who took on politics. Then Apirana, he took on the law as a means of solving a lot of the Maori difficulties. Wirape with Trangihiro Bak both took on medical as a means of improving the health of the Maori people.
The result of that was the arresting of decline in numbers, so that from the lowest we've had of 42,000 in 1895, the numbers started rising again. 95% of the Maori people were still in their isolated rural settlements, that even though they may be interspersed in some areas with Pākehā farmers, they were still based mainly on subsistence agriculture, which has its own Maori cultural counterpart.
Apirana became interested in the development of Maori land. Instead of Maori selling their land, he tried to encourage them to work it themselves. The whole difficulty with Maori land development was the fact that they weren't able to get finance to develop the land.
Seddon travelled ceaselessly, making countless speeches, giving countless promises, and generally winning the support of the country. But for all that, much of the legislation for which he's given credit was introduced by his predecessor, Balance, and carried through by Seddon while he was Premier from 1893 to 1906. He loved to be interrupted in his office. He was freely available to any voter. His lasting legacy, because no Prime Minister since has had the courage to stop what has become a tradition.
He was a person with no very identifiable political philosophy, except it would be true to say he had a big heart. He could walk into a pub and shout everybody a drink and everyone in there would vote for him. He had a very warm, appealing personality. And I think that what I've called his big heart came out in, say, the old age pensions. That's the only important radical legislation that he introduced. New Zealand and some of the Australian colonies were famous for introducing very radical legislation like industrial arbitration and so on. In the Australian colonies, you had the rise of labour parties. What the New Zealand Liberal government succeeded in doing was to stop the rise of labour parties. Or, if one put it another way, the unions backed the Liberals. But certainly one of Seddon's aims was to keep the labour unions behind the Liberal Party while doing as little as possible for them. He had one weakness. I think he didn't like strong rivals. Stout was his chief rival, so he made him Chief Justice. Chief Justice has to be rather silent. He sent Reeves off to England as High Commissioner. Seddon wasn't a New Zealander, of course. He was an immigrant from Britain. And he spent a lot of time talking about the Empire. In those days, of course, political speeches went on for hours. He would talk for 4 hours, 5 hours to a political meeting, and they loved it. He said he used to play on them like a piano. And he used to rant and rave about the Queen and the Empire and fighting. I doubt whether anyone exercised the same domination over the electorate that he did.
Seddon died in office in 1906 and was succeeded by Joseph Ward. Later that year, Ward was in Christchurch for the opening of their exhibition, held with great pomp and ceremony to extol the virtues of the province of Canterbury, and in a wider sense to show New Zealanders what they were capable of achieving.
Everybody looks upon it as a marvellous thing, and we've got a lot of people came to New Zealand. Of course, they came to see the exhibition.
It was wonderful. I went to the opening. I'd made myself a very nice outfit. I thought I was just Christmas, even to having a train on my skirt. It was marvellous, the number of men that were in uniform, very colourful.
There was a variety of fancy gadgets there, like the toboggan and cats and jammer castle, chamber of horrors, water chute, all those odd things.
The water chute. I thought, I'll have to go on the water chute. I went up all right, and then it was the coming down. Well, I tried to brace myself, but I couldn't. And it was coming down that fast, and I grabbed the man in front of me with the collar. No, hang on, no, grim death. And when it all happened so quickly that when we got out, he just turned round and looked at me and he says, "What have I ever done to you that you wanted to strangle me?" and I got for my life. Oh, that was an old thing that wandered round and round. The dragon come along, you were sitting on the side and they used to haul you off. But that was wonderful, you know. It was the best one of all the exhibitions.
The exhibition was a great success. Indeed, no one expected otherwise. The thought would have been quite unacceptable to Canterbury's Edwardian gentry. In material things, Christchurch was fortunate. Settled by a carefully graded cross-section of British society in 1850, it had been wealthy from the start. And more than half a century after its founding, it still retained much of Britain's class consciousness. Within this setting, ladies didn't work. That was unthinkable. Society was simply not set up to employ them. What remained for them were interminable domestic pursuits and looking forward to a suitable marriage. Meanwhile, the study of the fashions could pass the time. And what extraordinary fashions there were.
The women's hats were enormous, and the very wealthy ones had masses of ostrich feathers. And they were skewered on with the most murderous long hat pins, you know, about a foot long and very sharp. And it was quite dangerous to sit near them in trams and things in case you got spiked with one of these.
Sir Joseph Ward went to the Imperial Conference in 1907, and it was decided that the self-governing colonies would be called dominions. Now, of course, Australia, the Australian colonies had federated. They were called a Commonwealth. Canada was called a Dominion, but New Zealand was still called a colony. So he thought it was an advance for New Zealand to be called a Dominion.
And the territory belonging thereto shall be called and known by the title of the Dominion of New Zealand.
But when Ward announced it, Massey said the name was pretentious and would make New Zealand ridiculous. I think he meant that it suggested we were as important as Canada. But you could say that that was a step in the direction of independence, even if it was in name only.
As isolated as we were from international trends and discussion, some New Zealanders showed tremendously advanced thinking in the world of technology. About the same time as the Wright brothers were trying to solve the riddle of powered flight, a Temuka farmer, Richard Pierce, was also obsessed with the will to fly. Working entirely from scratch, with only his own ideas to go on, he fashioned an oval-winged monoplane. There were many who saw that aircraft become airborne and fly 150 yards or so before it crashed into the top of a 12-foot gorse hedge. But no one recalls exactly when. Most reports put it early in 1904.
Anybody knew you couldn't fly. 99 people out of 100 thought he was mad, stupid, wasting his time. Whereas he must have been one of the world's geniuses. Wright never made a machine, but he built an engine himself out on the farm. And he flew. He was something out of the bag. Pierce was.
Others tried the thrill of building and flying their own machines. This monoplane, built by Charles Fisher in Wellington, was flown in the Wairarapa by Theo White.
Fisher'd been running around on the ground with the wings off, trying to get used to the controls. And I said, what about letting me have a go at it? I wanted to see the machine, see if it would fly. So I got into the machine and we started off. I got about 10 feet off and I sailed along for about 50 yards or so like that. It seemed to be quite easy to control. You could keep the height about 10 feet off the ground. And she landed quite well because she had good shock absorbers. Charlie wanted me to take him up with him on the back. It didn't come off though, did it, Charlie? I don't know why. Well, I was scared before I got into the machine, but once you get into the machine, you haven't got time to think of being frightened.
Man could fly, but in 1908, the North Island Main Trunk Railway wasn't completed when the government decided, to impress the people, to run a special train through from Wellington to Auckland to meet the American Great White Fleet.
It was when Sir Joseph Ward was Prime Minister, and they just completed joining the rails together, a temporary track, and he decided to bring the parliamentary special up from Wellington, 200 members on board, and their wives and that. going right through by train. The train left Wellington on August the 7th, and of course it really caused a great stir. There were over 300 people down at the old Thorndon station to see it all, and the engine they had on was one of the Wellington 102 companies, number 17. Now the journey itself, they had no steam heat, and you can imagine what it was like in August in the main trunk. And some of the passengers, when they woke in the morning, there was icicles formed inside the windows. The train also had the distinction of carrying 8 bags of stewed island oysters to be used for the banquet of the American fleet officers.
26 hours after they'd started, thousands of Aucklanders welcomed the half-frozen passengers who'd come to see the Great White Fleet.
There could have been from 30 to 60 ships in the harbour, all white, and of course you can imagine how they showed up. And at night time, lit up, they just looked wonderful. You imagine to have a whole fleet in your harbour and visiting Americans above everybody else. The country went mad.
It was a most impressive sight. 12 or 13,000 sailors poured into town, American sailors, in 1908. They put on tremendous receptions for these Americans. In fact, there were letters in the paper saying that we were wasting far too much money entertaining them. The American President, Roosevelt, had sent the fleet on a world tour, I think to demonstrate American might, but particularly to impress the Japanese. The Japanese had just beaten the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. And the New Zealand government invited the fleet here as a kind of demonstration that we were not completely defenceless.
Militarily, we weren't defenceless, we had friends to call on, but industrially it was different. In 1913, a farmers' government was in power under William Ferguson Massey, and they were in no mood to put up with demands from trade unionists. The country was sick and tired of being held to ransom, they said.
The turn of the century saw the industrial conciliation and arbitration system in operation, but for the workers of that day, it looked a bit like a heads I win, tails you lose concept, where the government was saying to the workers, well, if you don't come into this structure, we'll push you into it, and if you don't agree to that, then we'll bring in a group of people who'll break any strike that you set up and make it legal. I mean, the whole point was that the government could control this situation by legalizing or making illegal the workers' action. And I suppose the greatest conflict occurred in Waihi, a gold mining town, pretty tough industrial labor with a strong militant miners' union, and there was a direct confrontation. There was sufficient straight-out violence to kill one miner, to injure others, and to mean that the miners' leaders ended up in jail.
If the women had kept out of it, it would have made things quite a bit easier, but a lot of the women were counterparts of the old girls that knitted at the foot of the guillotine, and they created quite a bit of trouble.
Now, this militancy of the workers fueled the fire of direct action. William Ferguson Massey, the new Reform Prime Minister, and his supporters, the farmers who came down on their horses and with their batons in their hands, defeated the waterfront workers in the Great Strike of 1913.
Massey's toughness with the strikers made his name hated by unionists for years. But while there was trouble in New Zealand, some were aware of greater danger in Europe, impending war.
In 1909, Sir Joseph Ward offered to donate to Great Britain a dreadnought. The dreadnought was the largest class battleship then in the world. In the finish, what we donated was a battle cruiser in New Zealand, which took part in some famous actions in World War I. It was a very formidable ship. It could do 23 knots. I'm told that we were still paying for the New Zealand up to World War II. But the battleship itself was scrapped in the early 1920s under the Washington Agreement.
Oh yes, I recall the battleship New Zealand, and I also recall our old neighbour was talking to my father about it, and he was walking up and down, and he had a peculiar habit of bending down and picking up a piece of clay off his foot and kneading it in his hand, and he was walking around saying, "The country will be bankrupt, the country will be bankrupt, we simply can't afford all this expenditure." And within a few years, we were spending millions upon millions on battleships.
August the 4th, 1914, war was declared. and in a wave of imperialist fervour, thousands answered the call to arms.
When war broke out in 1914, I joined up with the local mounted troops and went into camp with the Wellington Mounted Rifles Regiment. Training was not very strenuous, and we left our pony for Wellington to embark on the troops waiting there late in September. But we were held up temporarily for a few weeks regarding departure, because word had been received that the German cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were cruising in the Pacific, and we waited further heavier naval escort before we departed to join up with the Australian troops across the Tasman. From there we went on. We arrived at Alexandria on the 3rd of December 1914. From there we entrained to Zitoun, a small village on the outskirts of Cairo, and we were there doing pretty heavy training for the next few months prior to the Gallipoli campaign. We looked after the horses well. It was tough on them, and you know, the heavy sand going and so on. But at the end of the day, the men always made sure that the horses were watered first, and then themselves afterwards, although all would be pretty thirsty. But they did that, and they also groomed them.
Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, conceived the idea of attacking Germany's ally Turkey through the Dardanelles. The whole plan of storming the Dardanelles with naval power was a complete failure, and only served to warn the Turks of further attacks. With the determination of men defending their homeland, the Turks, under the personal command of legendary Mustafa Kemal, put up a withering fire against the Anzac invader, desperately maintaining a toehold on Gallipoli 2,500 yards long by a mere 1,000 yards wide.
My first impression of Gallipoli was just like the pictures I'd seen in the Boer War. Men were rushing forward and shells were bursting round about the place.
Attack followed grim attack. Acts of great gallantry went almost unnoticed as both sides carved each other, until the dead were causing such a health hazard that an armistice for a day allowed both sides time for burials. But for the living...
We were all in a very sorry state. With the poor food, and the flies affected the food. As soon as you opened a tin of jam or anything like that, they were right into it. There was a lot of dysentery or near dysentery. We had periscopes, but we didn't have the periscopic rifles. We had to sort of make our own. And they're very poor. I mean, the Turks were a long way ahead of us with their rifles and hand grenades.
After nearly 8 months, without let-up and without gain, the mutilated units silently, skillfully departed from Gallipoli. The whole murderous, useless operation cost 2,721 New Zealand lives and 4,752 wounded, some of whom died later. Refreshed and reformed in Egypt, the cavalry now became involved in a totally different kind of war. Again uniting with the Australians, they formed the Anzac Division against their old adversary, the Turks, but this time over the barren wastes of Egypt and Palestine. Driving the Turks before them, they recaptured Palestine, pushed on through the Sinai Desert to Gaza and on to Jerusalem. By February 1918, Jericho was captured, and the division pushed on, away from the pest-ridden town to heavy fighting at Amman, where they were repulsed. Moving on, they came to the dust-laden oven of the Jordan Valley.
With 120 in the shade there, you couldn't hold the bolt of your rifle, it would burn your hand. But one of the biggest problems in the Jordan Valley was the mosquitoes. They were as big as sparrows, some of them.
terrific thing. That's they used to give the horses terrible times.
By late October, the Australians and New Zealanders had inflicted heavy casualties among the Turks. And by month's end, when an armistice took effect in that area, they were in control of Damascus. After Gallipoli, early in 1916, the infantry had been taken to camp in England for further training before going on to France.
Take me back to dear old 90, put me on the train for London town. Take me over there, drop me anywhere, Liverpool, Leeds or Birmingham, well I don't care.
Well, Slough was a terrible place as far as we were concerned. Basic army training for infantry. Shooting, marching, parade ground drill. And the session always finished up in what they called the bull ring, which was supposed to convert civilians into soldiers. And it was very, very effective too. They were tough.
At the end of training, they paraded for His Majesty King George V. And there too, to witness the presentation of medals for bravery, was Prime Minister Massey, who, as leader of the government, travelled to England for imperial war conferences. Trained and equipped, the division reached France in April 1916. And after a quiet initiation to trench warfare, they were committed to the artillery duels of the Somme.
They concentrated every artillery weapon that they had. They were just wheel to wheel. And I think 0 hour was just as it's breaking dawn, and the whole place blew up, you see, just like a volcano erupting. The whole of the artillery all opened up, and away she went.
03:10 hours, the 7th of June.
The first tanks came over at Messines, because they were only 5 miles an hour. But they put the fear of him up. He didn't know what them blazes was coming over, and he saw those. Neither did we. But they were ferocious-looking things.
You just imagine having a weapon of that sort, having a steel monster coming at you. You can imagine how demoralising it was.
When the whistle blew, you just got up and took your... There was flashing and noise going and shells dropping. You'd keep up as close as possible to your own barrage. And while the Jerry was dazed, you'd hop in.
Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, the world's first flying ace. Aerial warfare was just in its infancy. New Zealanders, who were smitten by the thrill of flying, paid to be trained privately in Auckland and Christchurch before joining the Royal Flying Corps.
Our load would be, normally, 250 high explosive and 4 Coopers, or 3 112-pound high explosives. And that was varied according to targets. We had no aids to navigation. We had a compass, and that was all, and that often varied. Consequently, that the whole thing was visual. They used the tracer bullet quite a lot because as we sat on the petrol tank, one bullet in there, and well, of course, that was a good exit from this world for you.
There's no parachutes. It was said by the higher-ups that if a pilot could bring his machine home, even although it might have caught fire, it was much better than him coming down in a parachute and leaving his machine in the air and really wasting good machines. That's the way they put it, but of course they weren't flying the damn thing.
Flying was a clean war, but down on the ground, winter conditions made life unbearable.
Ghastly hell. It was just mud, mud, mud. Trenches half full of mud. And you're wet through all the time.
Oh, frightful. You've no idea what it was like. You lived in dugouts and you were pretty well over your ankles in mud all the time. You had no protection. You just had a ground sheet over you. You wake up in the morning with the snow over your feet, and you were everlastingly in dampness.
Messines, the Somme 1916 and 1918, Passchendaele, Ypres, the Hindenburg Line, Le Quesnoy. The cost of maintaining our division in France for 2.5 years was appalling. Our total casualties were 18,500 dead, nearly 50,000 wounded, many twice or more. This was a terrible price to pay, when our population then was only just over 1 million.
In their rejoicings at the signing of the armistice, which brings to an end the agony of the past 4 years, the people of New Zealand give thanks to Almighty God for the men living and dead of the New Zealand Division. From the landing at Anzac on April the 25th, 1915, to the surrender of Turkey and the storming of Le Quesnoy, who have fought and conquered in battles whose names shall be familiar in our mouths as household words. You have won for New Zealand a fame imperishable. God bless you and bring you safely home to us.
To the troops returning home in glory, there's some little reason to worry for the future. The war to end all wars had been fought and won. New Zealand's prosperity was assured, and there were few who would have predicted that the festivities of 1918-19 would not continue into 1920.